Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion, ReCentering Justice in Theological Education. Sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. The conversation taking place today is similar to the dialogue that happens in our academic classrooms. Union would love to be in touch with you about your opportunities to further your theological education. Please contact our admissions office at admissions@upsem.edu. We have exciting updates about womanist perspectives in the classroom, degree programs, educational platforms, and financial aid. This Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, join the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and Union Presbyterian Seminary admissions to learn how to continue your theological education. Register at eventbrite.com. Our panelists are Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharris, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, associate professor of African American religious history at Vanderbilt University. Our host and moderator is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, instructor of ethics, theology, and culture, and director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Reverend Jones, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Just Talk, Talk Just series webinar, which is sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. The year of 1963 marked a monumental moment for America when the Civil Rights Movement launched its nonviolent protests against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, led by the young Black preacher and scholar, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. From the prison cell in Birmingham, where King was arrested for his resistance efforts, King penned the letter from Birmingham jail to confront white Alabama clergymen who claimed the efforts of King and civil rights protesters were unwise and untimely. Later that year, in his famous speech at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King spoke of the fierce urgency of now and why Black Americans could no longer wait for justice and equality with the refrain, "Now is the time." King proclaimed, quote, "This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children." King's prophetic charge in the summer of 1963 influenced the book Why We Can't Wait, that recounted the most pivotal year in civil rights history and analyzed the legal maxim that justice delayed is justice denied. Days before his assassination, King went to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 1968, roughly 54 years ago, to organize the sanitation workers' strike for working Black men making a measly $1.80 an hour with no benefits or days off. And King was shot dead before his protest efforts were realized. King was assassinated in Memphis, not just because he espoused love over hate, reconciliation over retaliation, but because he called for a radical redistribution of wealth beyond a theology of scarcity, where the 1% hold 80% of the wealth and the 99% or the rest of us are left to settle with the measly 20% of what is left. King believed that all God's children can eat well and be full. In 2022, we are still in the midst of multiple pandemics, with repeals to voting rights and a devastating housing crisis, just to name a few, that threaten the survival of the least of these. And still, the struggle for freedom and equality with equal citizenship and economic justice is far from over. A 2019 report by the Institute for Policy Studies, Dreams Deferred, How Enriching the White Percent Widens the Racial Wealth Divide. The wealth of white median families today is $146,984, which marks a 30% increase in the last 30 years. The wealth of Black median families has fared the worst in the last 33 years. Such a reality situates Black median families on the path to zero wealth by 2082. Time has not proven better for systemically excluded communities economically. Time has not proven better for these United States of amnesia when there is still turmoil about who should receive access to the ballot box. Lest we forget, as the prophetic writer James Baldwin once said, there is never a time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. Social justice is God talk, and never a conversation we can table for later, but it always bears witness to the here and the now. What does the Lord have to say about a nation divided by ideological difference, racial disparity, and income equality? Where is God's voice in these tumultuous times? What does the church have to say in response to these issues that threaten to undo our democracy and undermine our unity as a country? How might we, as theological schools, institutions, recenter justice and address these concerns in a contemporary era? We are grateful tonight to convene two religious leaders and scholars to engage this topic of recentering justice in theological education. For those who have just joined us, I again am Melanie Jones, the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, and I teach ethics and theology here at Union Presbyterian Seminary. We are joined tonight by my teacher, Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, who is Associate Professor of African American Religious History in the Divinity School and Graduate Department of Religion, and an affiliate faculty in Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections of racial, ethnic identity, religious thought, popular culture, and social political activism in modern American society. In addition to numerous articles, chapters, and publications, he is the author of The Origins of Black Humanism, Liberating Black Church History, Black Church Studies and Introduction, The Altars Where We Worship, Religion in the Age of Obama, and is working on his next book-length project on the history of African American religion in New York City's legendary Black community of Harlem. Dr. Juan is the executive director for the Society for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and Religion, co-founder and executive member, committee member of the Black Religious Scholars Group, an organization that generates meaningful and empowering dialogue intending to unite the church, community, and scholars in Black religion in order to confront the most provocative issues confronting people of African descent across the diaspora. Together with his partner in life and in love, Dr. Stacy Floyd-Thomas, he has the utmost pleasure and pride of raising their beloved daughter, Lillian Makeda Floyd-Thomas. Welcome, Dr. Juan. Our second panelist tonight is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharris, who works on the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival with the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber. She is the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, as well as a professor at Union Theological Seminary. She is the editor of We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign, Always With Us, author of What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, Religion News Service, Sojourners, Religious Dispatches, and elsewhere. She has been widely regarded and awarded with the 30th Annual Freedom Award from the National Civil Rights Museum, the Hunger Leadership Award, the Villanova Peace Award, named one of the 15 leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress, the Selma Bridge Award recipient, and named one of 11 women shaping the church. Dr. Theoharris, we are so happy and excited that you have joined us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you to our esteemed panelists for giving your time to this important conversation. I don't want to prolong us any longer. I want us to jump right into the conversation. So let's begin. I want to begin with you, Dr. Liz. What made you become active or decide to become active in the Poor People's Campaign and ultimately to go on to lead the Cairo Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice?
Well, first of all, just thank you so much for having me, having us here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation and discussion. I was raised in a family that was dedicated to doing social justice, but based on our faith. I was a Sunday school teacher by the age of 13, a deacon by 16, and really spent my whole life engaged in kind of the prophetic ministry of, modeled after Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? And so when I met poor and homeless folks that were organizing when I went off to college, I had I learned from them about the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, a campaign, the last campaign that Dr. King waged, was convinced into by the welfare rights movement and other poor and low-income folk. And I learned about that from other poor and low-income people, and said, well, in our day and age, what are we doing about this? Don't we not just need to look back and honor those that have come before us, but actually pick up the baton and carry it the next mile? And so I've been, trying to live into what it would look like to reignite a new Poor People's Campaign for today for many years, for really decades. So then as we approach the 50th anniversary of that campaign, the Reverend Dr. William Barber II out of North Carolina and myself teamed up and brought our networks together and said, let's launch a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, because, here, 50 years after Dr. King and the welfare rights leaders and folks out of Appalachia and indigenous folk, we have 140 million people who are poor and low income, who can't afford a couple $100 emergency. We have, tens of millions of folks that are working, are called essential now, right? In this pandemic, they're called essential, but they're paid expendable wages and benefits. The world is made of 2/3 water, as Dr. King said right before he was killed, and yet 15 million families in the United States can't afford water. And so out of that, and from my own both faith upbringing and my own experience of poverty, even homelessness, I felt like I could be in no other thing than to build a call for a moral revival and a Poor People's Campaign for today. And so I find myself in a position where I'm getting to partner with poor and low income leaders and moral leaders and clergy and activists and advocates all over the country who are saying, it's immoral, it's wrong to be able to have 5 abandoned houses and five houses for every homeless person in this country, and yet have the average age of homelessness being 9 years old, right? I mean, that it's immoral and wrong to throw out more food than it takes, not just to feed everyone in this country, but everyone that's hungry throughout the world. And yet, half of kids in this country are going to bed in food insecure homes. And it doesn't have to be this way. We have no scarcity. God created enough, but we have somehow messed that up, not followed God's commandments, and instead are living in a country and in a world that has a scarcity of moral consciousness and political will to actually lift the load of poverty, address systemic racism, save the planet, and turn this war economy into a peace economy as we challenge this kind of false moral narrative of religious and Christian nationalism. And so I find myself, inspired every day by poor and low income people who are organizing, in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions, to be able to right the wrongs of our society.
Dr. Juan, as I reflected today, just a bit ago about King, I thought that when people hear the story of King, sometimes recounted, they forget that he was actually a trained theologian. That there's some history there in terms of that. I'm just curious, I see you as a scholar activist, as a religious historian, by scholarship, but also activists in your work with the Black Religious Scholars Group and other organizations. Tell us a little about what brings you to the question of justice in your own work.
Thank you so much, the Right Reverend Professor Jones. And I'd be remiss if I didn't just take a moment to say how humbled and honored I am to be in this esteemed company right now. When the invitation came out, even though, this start of the semester has been really hectic, when that quadruple phenomenon known as Melanie Jones, teacher, researcher, now, oh my gosh, administrator, and lest we forget researcher par excellence. When you all reached out to me, I knew I had to sign up. So please know you're doing your old professor proud by everything you're doing right now, especially how you're lifting up the name of Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. So thank you on that tip. And also, it's a pleasure to meet the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharris. Your work speaks volumes for you and about you, but also I never had the chance to say directly in person how the passing of your father has meant so much to those of us who dare think of a world that can encompass freedom, justice, equality, and democracy. What he lent to and meant to movements of liberation and justice help fuel that passion for justice that I have to this day. And we are all indebted to your family, to you and all. So I just wanted to say that. My heart was burning. I needed to let that go. To the question that was posed, I'll take the second I have left. Very much, in my, as I was reaching some level of maturity, especially in the 70s and 80s, when we still had a remnant of what we could dare call a religious left that was modeled after the work of King and Jesse Jackson, still embodied by the folks like I'm thinking Ella Baker, I'm thinking of John Lewis, but then also moving broadly and widely to the works of Dorothy Day and Michael Harrington. I'm thinking about, obviously the legacy of Abraham Heschel. There were so many figures who at that early stage, even though we didn't give life or language to it, who showed us, who informed us in a great variety of ways that religion has a place in this struggle, in this battle, right? When you think of, we just recently lost Desmond Tutu. When you think about the works of Oscar Romero, or the ongoing contributions of Father Gustavo Gutierrez, there's so many folks, so many figures in this struggle who didn't think it was in any way, shape, or form a disconnect to make your work and the world that you want to see synonymous, right? In this, I think about somebody like Dr. Cannon. I think about James Cone, right? And even another mentor in terms of Vincent Harding, right? So those works, those individuals help feed and inform me, so that right around 1997, as a graduate student, when the occasion came about, and myself, my spouse, Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas, right? At the time, we were not married, but that's a whole other conversation. Our other colleagues, Joy Bostick and Dwayne Belgrave, when we sat in a hotel room in New Orleans at the time and said, religious scholars, right? Theologians, we need to do more than just talk about what the church used to do. We now have to, kind of push the conversation and help build bridges rather than barriers between activists, folks who are just, trying to do their level best to be good citizens and decent members of community, as well as church folks, and even try to expand the conversation beyond just the church to bring in folks who sometimes, either by choice or by force, have moved away from or beyond the church, right? And so we've been doing that work now for close to 25 years. And, we've had some ups and downs, but I think that now we're finally on a trajectory to say, all right, there should not be any kind of wall of division between social justice and divine justice.
Absolutely. When I hear both perspectives, right, in terms of Dr. Liz speaking about the context of being able to be kind of this kind of grassroots organizing and be in the company of the people and of the folk. And I hear a parallel conversation happening as Dr. Juan speaks to it in the academy, about scholars saying, yes, we need to be with the folk and be in conversation and communion towards these questions, because we both have similar questions, right? How do we begin to change and recenter justice given what we all are doing in this current world? I see theological institutions developing centers that are dealing with the issues of justice. And I like the term center, whether the name center is a part of the organizations or the group's kind of formation, whether it says, the Center for Black Church Studies or the Center for Islamic Studies. I like the name of center because center to me says something about this kind of center versus margins, that justice is not something that is a supplement, right? Or an add-on, or, you can take Bible and justice as an aside, right? It is not seen as something central to the conversation, but rather what I see in terms of theological institutions being able to see centers or these structures that now deal with the question of justice, to make that central to our conversation in theological education. I'm asking, what do you think might be the impetus for that? And what role do you think these centers feel in terms of helping to connect or fill in missing gaps in theological education? Dr. Juan or Dr. Liz, either one, yeah.
Well, as you outed me as a historian, I can give you just a kind of brief anecdote, and maybe this will shed some light. About 10 or so years ago, back when we could have open houses and have mass visitations by prospective students, I was invited to be one of a number of the program or institute representatives on behalf of the Kelly Miller Smith Institute for Black Church Studies. I'm in the room, and long story short, when it came to Q&A, the visitors were invited to ask a question. In the back of the room, I can never forget, there was a young African-American prospect. He gets up and asks, "Do you all teach that Black liberation theology?" Okay, I took that, and then, quickly in this brain of mine, I processed it, and the answer that came out was, "Why, yes. Now, what would you like us to teach? A Black enslavement theology?" Forgive the dad joke of it all, but part of the response I was giving at that time, in the midst of the Obama era, in the midst of a time where many colleagues, students, friends, neighbors, right, were looking at me sideways and asking, why am I still talking about white supremacy? Aren't we in the good times now? And isn't everything just hunky dory? Some of those folks have now come back around and apologized or left me gift baskets or what have you. But I say all that to say, the work of justice and liberation shouldn't be a trend or a fad. It shouldn't rise or fall like waves on the ocean, right? We need to be about this work in season and out of season, right? That's why the Poor People's Campaign and the awesome work that you all are doing is so vitally necessary, right? Moral Mondays were so vitally necessary. When people wanted to act as if, oh, there's no problem with voting, there's no problem with, how dare you, right? The struggle continues often and always. So what we have to do is be ever mindful when our institutions may not automatically, lend money or curriculum to the effort, when you may, as I and my spouse have experienced, you might be the only person on campus who might be dealing with or teaching certain subject matters, right? Prior to our arrival here at Vanderbilt, right? You still do it. We still need to do it until reinforcements come. You got to be the ones you're waiting for. If I'm properly quoting that great adage, we are the ones. Right. So now that we have some more institutional, especially in the wake of the racial reckoning of 2020, now that we have some more attention or some more reinforcements, the library has bought some more books, and now a different range of courses can be introduced into a standardized curriculum. Okay. I feel seen. I feel a little bit heard, but we need to do more. And I'll stop there.
I just love that answer. And it really corroborates my experience as well. About 20 years ago, I helped to pull together a study to looking at about 30 seminaries and who was teaching something about poverty. And found that despite the fact that congregations are often the first stop when a family's in need, they're on the risk of being evicted, can't pay heat or light bills, need a little extra food or backpacks for their kids to go to school with, that 20 years ago, actually even a little more than that, close to 25 years ago, none of our major seminaries were doing anything systematic. There was a person or a course here or there. The Floyd-Thomases were out in the forefront, and there were a couple of other lone voices in the wilderness who were raising these issues, but it wasn't anything systematic. That's actually where the Cairo Center is kind of born from. We did this survey and then challenged the administration at Union at the time, Union Theological Seminary in New York. I love being at Union Presbyterian in Virginia as Presbyterian and as someone who has learned so much from so many, including Katie Geneva Cannon for sure. But challenge the administration of Union Theological Seminary in New York City to put poverty and a movement that could actually address poverty and those that are most impacted by poverty and racism, to put them and this movement at the absolute center of the curriculum. And we worked with actually faculty and staff and the administration and students and tried to figure out what would that even look like. And we had to look other places and see some of these centers and some of these institutes. And, there was a question of like, well, do we need to first have a couple $1 million endowment before we start anything? And, all of those kinds of questions. And we kept on saying, learning from prophetic leaders of the past, well, what do our sacred texts and traditions say? What do our theological foundations say? And Deuteronomy says, you can't separate piety from economics. And so why is it possible for us to separate seminary education from the work of economic and racial justice? And similarly, we kept on looking at different movements in this nation and into this world's history. And you can't separate, the kind of battle of theology that's going on out there from movements for justice that are happening, both within our theological educational walls as well as in the streets. And so I really believe that we have to kind of keep that light going and burning and reminding all of us of what is really at the core of our traditions. And that is that starting in Genesis and going through Revelation, if you're going to look at the Bible, and you could then also look at other traditions and texts, but is this arc that says that God hates poverty, hates inequality, hates racism, and that God's followers, God's servants are called to be involved in the forefront of movements for justice. And so I think we need theological education to put at its absolute center that call of the gospel, because it's, again, if you take that out, it all falls apart.
I see in the comments here some questions about from Clancy, or not a question, but a comment from Clancy Ratliff. I don't know a lot about Justice Center, she says, but I like the work of, she names Creation Justice Ministries. They're very concerned with environmental racism. And it brought up for me, how might we think about this work as the Academy being able to also have this conversation about justice also with the church, and them being able, how can the Academy and the church speak to each other rather than doing our own things in somewhat separate silos? Dr. Liz, Dr. Juan, you can weigh in. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, but I mean, indeed, not just our seminaries, but our whole society has kind of become very siloed. So you have some folk over here that are interested in, health ministries, and you have some folk over here that are talking about racial justice, and you have the environmentalists over here, and you have the peace people over there. Even in our progressive movements, that's the case, let alone in our very bifurcated society, very divided society, these yet to be United States, right? And so it's no accident that's the case when it comes to our seminaries, and comes to theological education, is that we have everything kind of separated, and that means separating the church and the academy, and separating both the church and the academy from the people. But again, if we look, at something like the abolitionist movement, you had folks that were scholars, who were bringing their knowledge and their insight. You had folks that were church leaders, who were bringing their bases of folk and their religious upbringing, and you had this underground railroad with Harriet Moses Tubman, leading the way to freedom, both, with the enslaved that she was able to help lead into actual, out of actual U.S. chattel slavery, and but also with kind of challenging the very notion of slavery's existence. And so you have all of these different roles that have to be played. And we look at movements throughout history, that you always have folks in the academy, folks in our religious institutions, and folks just in our communities, on our streets. And often, too often, they're separated. But if we're really going to get at change, it means the kind of bringing together, the coming together of those, and everybody having various roles to play. But and we all don't have to do exactly the same thing, But I mean, I know when I was organizing welfare recipients in Philadelphia, we had a woman who knew how to get people's electricity turned back on. Now, if we asked her to write a press release, maybe all those people that she was getting their electricity turned back on would have lost their electricity, right? And so we all have a role to play. I'm not saying all of us have to do the same thing, but we all have to be kind of working for common cause and for a common purpose, and together, and having that coordinated and not being separated into silos. But seeing that the whole is bigger than the sum of each of its parts.
I want to echo and absolutely agree with what my esteemed colleague has just said, that a delegation or division of labor is necessary because, yes, not everybody can do everything, but somebody has to do something. And so the notion that, and I'll just put this on a more colloquial level, if I'm sick and laying in need of rest and recovery, not everyone has the bedside manner that you desperately need or hope for, right? Each person, I'm going to go into my Marx bag here, right? Each to their need, each to their own ability, right? So the idea that, and Melanie, you can attest to this, that one of the things that I try to teach, especially within the scope of Black church studies, is that we need to break down the presumption of some kind of difference between the pastoral and the prophetic. Sometimes the most prophetic thing you can do for any individual or community is tell them that they're capable of love and worthy of receiving such, right? And sometimes the most pastoral thing you can do is, once again, making sure that someone's lights get turned back on, making sure that, every school child has vaccinations and meals and a safe place that they can raise and get up in the morning and go to sleep at night. Like, sometimes those two concerns are perfectly melded, I think, within the will of God. Last thing I would say is also, and here I am here, Melanie, you had time here at this fine institution at Vanderbilt, where more than 50 years ago, James Lawson, as a young Methodist student here at this institution, right, was doing the work, was training, and upon the cosign of Dr. King, no less, right? And that's a heck of a recommender for anybody to receive. But he came to this institution and yet was working in the Nashville community, not because of Vanderbilt, but in spite of Vanderbilt. And to the point where, the higher ups, I won't talk too bad about them, but, the folks at that time wanted to run him out of town, right? Some 50 years later, we have now established the James Lawson Institute for the Research and Study of Nonviolent Movements. The stone that the builder refused has become the head cornerstone, right? And I'm not saying that came easily or without struggle or hard work, but the idea that the very thing that the institution thought was going to tank it is exactly the issues, the concerns, the perspective that promise a brighter future. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, I think that history is something that is repeated. As I hear Dr. Liz talking about the formation of the Cairo Center, in terms of surveying the multiple theological institutions and realizing these spaces just don't exist, where there's systematic study of these questions. And then Dr. Juan Yes, the formation of the James Lawson comes with this long pattern history of the reality of groups, communities that have been systemically excluded. And I could say the same for the K. Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, at an institution that once supported the theological positions, or not even the institution itself, but there were faculty that supported, right, theological underpinnings of the Confederate, for there to be now a center, right, devoted to the nurturing the soul work of Black women. This really models not only what Katie Cannon believed in terms of moving beyond this, what she called the non-canonical other, or building and constructing a place where there could be freedom and flourishing, especially, right, for those communities that have said, you don't have a place here to belong. And now so that is the formation of these centers are justice work in and of itself. I see a question here that is from Danita Nelson, asking about how can churches, or how can seminaries connect with churches? How can theological institutions connect with churches in order to sustain activism around these issues? And Gail Walker also asks a similar question: how can local churches begin to recenter justice in the local congregation? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I mean, and once again, all politics, all activism is local, right? So you got to hit the ground, right? You have to, put your feet on the ground and walk with folk, walk to folk, walk with folk, right? In a way so that every environment's not going to be identical. But one of the things I deeply embrace, through the Black Religious Scholars Group, this is work that we've been doing, is now almost 25 years, is meet with folk and try to understand their local context, their local concerns, right? So yeah, in my mind, I come to the table and I'm in total agreement with the issues of economic justice. I'm in total agreement with concerns about voting rights. But for this community, this context at this moment, they just might need their roads repaved and that stoplight down the corner fixed, because there have been 5 wrecks at that corner that jeopardized the folks in the community. And that's not saying that they're sloppy or slack. It just means, no, this is the thing that they most urgently and desperately need. Can you partner with them on this? And if you prove a worthwhile and a successful partner on this, they'll trust you. And one of the things, and I believe Dr. Liz was also attesting to this, is the building of both transparency and trust in this world, right? If you can gain someone's trust and prove that you're a worthy steward of it, folks will then say, hey, we have some young ministers who want to go to seminary. I trust you with them, right? You've been honest with me. I'm going to trust you with them. And dare I use dreaded words like empathy and reciprocity, but if you build up the capacity that folks know that you're as good as your word, and that when you have a fine student who can go out into the world and be better advertising than $1 million of TV and radio ads, I'm talking to you, Professor Jones. That's what we do in this world that means something.
And I think where I want to go a little bit with this question is coming back to some of the theological and biblical teachings that theological education can bring all of us, including local congregations, to. For 25 years of my life, I've done very grassroots anti-poverty organizing. Almost not a week goes by where somebody doesn't try to say, well, I don't know why you're talking about trying to end poverty, because Jesus says the poor will be with you always, right? Or I don't know why you're advocating for that child tax credit, because Paul writes that if you do not work, you shall not eat. And people find these biblical kind of excuses. Often they're just that. But still, it's not just amongst folks that have very different political and theological views from that kind of fall back on these kind of regular theological interpretations of why injustice exists and what we can do, or really kind of not do because of it. If we just go on assuming that isn't right, we don't agree with that, so therefore we're just going to let it lie. For a long time, for instance, with that passage, the poor will be with you always, I was like, well, that's just wrong. Let's talk about Matthew 25. Let's talk about Luke 4. Let's talk about, James 5, all of these passages. But if you just kind of let people interpret that the way it has kind of been hegemonically interpreted, which says that God wills poverty, that there's only going to be an end to poverty, pie in the sky when we die, which we know is a lie, that it's that this is as good as it gets. And that not just as a kind of political or economic statement, but a theological one. If we allow that, then guess what? The only response to poverty is either punishing the poor or pitying the poor, and therefore, offering a little bit of Band-Aids and charity, but never kind of going back to bringing the reign of God, which is give us our daily bread, forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors, deliver us from the evils of oppression, right? I mean, all of our kind of core theological teachings, biblical teachings, actually say something very different about the lack of inevitability of injustice and poverty and racism, and in fact, our responsibility to devote our whole lives, our bodies, our hearts, our minds, our souls to the work of bringing God's reign of justice here. And so to me, one of the key roles then that theological education and seminaries can play is battling out those theological assumptions, looking at history, finding examples of where, the social gospel movement, the Black freedom church traditions, all of the different, parts of history that we have to lean on, looking at theology and ethics, looking at practices of worship and preaching, and all of these different, amazing tools and learnings, and bringing it to the side of justice, and then helping our local congregations, helping our local religious leadership, helping our lay leadership, to actually see that if we're not out there fighting for justice on the streets every day, we are not doing what God requires of us. And I think that then that changes what we do in a local congregation, that changes our outlook about what can get done. And that helps to really bring about, a moral revival and a moral movement, and the kind of changing of policies and structures that have right now been kind of propped up by a heretical theology that must indeed be challenged.
If I could just add one more note, and I this is going to be an anecdote more than a note. A few years back, as part of a Black Church Studies program at Bright Divinity School, we reached out to local churches in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area. This one local church was growing by leaps and bounds, had gone from a little small living room church to like well over 1,000 or so members. The pastor was hadn't attended seminary, and so essentially was winging it, but was successful enough because folks just loved his personality and so forth. Anyway, within a stone's throw of the church, the city was zoning to have liquor stores and pawn shops and all the fine establishments that get lumped into communities of color, right? He was up in arms. He was outraged by this, right? Because this was just bad for the area, and he was right. But the issue was he didn't know how to go about the simple mechanics of local democracy, right? Didn't know, okay, send you and your people go down to local ordinance meetings and city council and everything like that. We tried to bring him up to speed, like give him a crash course in all this kind of mobilization, and he realized then what some of what he could have been benefited from or could have been exposed to within a seminary context. And I'm once again not saying that it's one size fits all, or that all seminaries attend to this universally or equally. But if one of the most important institutions on the planet, aka the church, right? I'm not talking about AKAs. Leave that off the table. Okay, no disrespect. But if one of the most important human endeavors we have, we're saying that education need not apply, that we're saying that we can deal with leadership who are just winging it and just doing the best they can, right? We cannot be the generation that does less with more, right? If we still hope to claim, that we're going to be part of God's great restoration of creation, right? We have to bring all our tools to this concern, and more importantly, right? I don't think God created us to live only neck down, right? God also, gave us heads with brains and things like that. We should hone and utilize those as well.
Yeah, I hear both of you speaking to the ways in which I often say the nature of theological education has shifted, not just because of who sits in our classrooms, in terms of the kind of students we encounter that might be unchurched, that might be compelled to the call of justice and see seminary as a way towards it, right? But also in what they're being sent out to do. We need preachers, we need priests, we need prophets, right? But we also need organizers, right? We also need some public theologians. We also need folks to do a multiplicity of things in the world. So I just really appreciate both of you speaking to that. Here's what Sabri Napier asks: how can we merge the academy, theological, and grassroots organization with the mission of teaching emerging generations about social justice? So how can we ultimately merge the academy, these organizations that we're speaking of, and and theological institutions with this mission of teaching about social justice, teaching each other about social justice?
Well, one thing I would say is that, and I believe that the movement for Black Lives has been at least one prime example of this, is that when young folks, both young biologically and chronologically, but also those who are young at heart, recognize and realize that, okay, if we wait for traditional modes and models of leadership and the traditional brokers of the peace, in terms of the pastors with the big steeple churches and the huge flocks, if we wait for them, we're just going to stay waiting, right? So we have to take action. We have to be in the streets, right? And I wrestle with this constantly, but I also think back to a saying that Gandhi once said, where it said, "Oh, there are my people. I am their leader. I must follow them." Right? Right. Every good leader, to some extent, is constantly chasing after what the people are doing. Right. And it doesn't mean that you're just simply going with the flow of traffic. No, it's all right. The people, if you are loving the people that you lead, if you're serving the people you hope to save, if you're reaching the people that you're trying to teach, right? You're at some point you have to be amenable to the fact that I might not know everything, or this isn't just strictly a top-down affair, right? It's a give and take. And oftentimes you're probably going to give more than you take in terms of notions of sacrifice. But this idea that, by and large, we have to come ready for the task at hand, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to call the shots in terms of laying out the agenda for what you're trying to remedy or rectify.
I really appreciate all of that. And I'm thinking, the problems of our society and of our people are really great and grave. And they didn't happen overnight. We didn't just wake up and have it more likely that lots of kids will end up shot or in prison than graduate from high school. It just wasn't an accident that, you have, 40 million people working jobs at less than a living wage, and not being able to. So these systems and structures that have contributed to and gotten us to where we are, where people are really suffering, it's going to take, it's going to take something really significant to get us out of it. And I have a colleague, a mentor in the work. His name is Willie Baptist, and he often will say, when you look at history, it's not that ever a dumb force defeats a smart force. So we need to have folk that are engaged rigorously, intellectually, developing kind of our consciousness and our capacity and our understanding of what's going on and what's gotten us here and what it's going to take. And hopefully that's coming out of the academy, but it's also coming out of kind of the university of adversity of people's lives. But again, we can't kind of struggle for justice without being deeply rooted in knowledge and strategy. And then when it comes to the church, again, my colleague often will say, there's almost no other form of mass media that has something as good to say about the poor as the Bible. And we can argue and say, I'm a biblical scholar and I'm a preacher, so I don't think of the Bible just as a form of mass media, but it surely is, translated into all kinds of languages, one of the most popular bestseller books. And it's something that we order our lives around, right? And our congregations and churches, try to live up to. And if the commandments of that Bible is to do justice and for nobody to have too little and nobody to have too much, if the message is if you give yourselves to the down and out, then your lives will glow, and you'll live in like a well-watered garden. If that's the message, then we have to put the church and the academy around the problems of the people, and then when we do that, we can come up with beautiful and amazing solutions to the problems that are at hand. But we can't do it if they're all separated, and we can't say, well, the academy and scholarship is over there and it has no place in the church, and we can't say that the rituals and the practices and the teachings and the theology of the church, have nothing to do with people's daily lives, and we can't allow for 140 million of God's children in these United States to suffer the indignity of poverty. It just can't be. And so if that's the case, then we have to. And then when you have to bring them together, you see how that can happen, and how you can actually learn from history, and you can learn from theory, and you can learn from theology, and you can learn from church practice and preaching, and you can apply it to the real problems of today, not just fiddle while Rome is burning, not just pontificate on fairies dancing on the head of a needle, but actually apply your knowledge and your practice and your theology to the problems of our society. And then, what, when you do that, you win.
Another quick point I would add is, in previous years, myself, my spouse, Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas, we served as theologians in residence for Friendship West down in Dallas under Freddie Haynes. And, it's a model that, hopefully you can build a kind of partnership with pastors, right? And once again, that issue of trust, transparency, truthfulness has to be in operation. But the idea that, you can help the pastor brainstorm and think through these issues and, expand and extend their purview. And also they can trust that you're not trying to run away with their church, or, not trying to, upset, folk in the congregation. Hopefully it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. But once again, that exposes the congregation to the beauty, hopefully, and the brilliance of theological education, but also shows that these two halves, seminary and sanctuary, ought not be enemies. We've always already been friends. Yeah.
Yeah, I served as a theologian in residence at Sweet Home Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, during my time at Seminary of the Southwest, and have found that kind of partnership, right, with churches who are in the thick of every day trying to help communities of faith gather and worship and learn was so impactful on both sides, in terms of them being able to engage these questions of ethics and questions about doctrines and things that we think laity aren't ready for. They are already having these questions in their own spaces and places, and they're ready to be engaged with them at these levels. So I certainly agree with that model, Dr. Juan. The last question, I could really sit with y'all all night, but I know that wouldn't be fair to y'all's families and to our time together. But as a result of this recentering, that we've been talking about all night, what are our hopes? What are our hopes for theological education? That as these institutions that we belong to and that we are informed by and that we send students to and so forth, what is possible from this recentering? What is our hope for theological education?
Well, I'll say that I'm always already imprisoned by hope. And what I mean by that is this notion that I didn't imagine that, especially given the last 5 years, I didn't know how we were going to make it through. I mean, and we're still not all the way clear from the madness and the mayhem that's been thrust upon us. But I truly and firmly believe that we are well equipped to move into a better, brighter future if we remember, first, empathy is something that has to be re-engaged, redeployed, vitalized in this day and time. The social distancing, the battles over vaccines and masking during the pandemic, the political polarization that we're still wrestling with, the corrosive quality and nature of these things are, to once again reference what Dr. Liz was saying, not coincidental, not accidental, right? This has been a structured, systematic attack on the very soul of the nation for the better part of 50 or 60 years, right? It took that long to get us to this wretched state. So it may just take at least that long to get us out of it. But we must start today, right? We must help people recognize that your fellow human being is not a curse, but is actually a blessing and a benefit to you and to the world around us, right? If we can at least help folks think that way and look at every person to their left, right, front, back, not as their enemy or their and I know sometimes it's hard, but we got to see each other with some modicum of compassion and some commitment that we, because of climate change and because of like all the kind of crises that are piling up on top of one another, right? We will not make it through this world alone. We must try to make it together.
Yes, thanks so much for that. I'm thinking that folks that are graduating from theological education right now are graduating still into a crisis. And so I think the question is, how do we equip people to play a moral theological education role in this, broken world. And I also agree. I'm surely a prisoner of hope, and not just because I want to be, not just because I want things to be okay, but because I can see that it's exactly in times like these. I'm the director of something called the Kairos Center. Kairos is a notion of time when old systems and structures of injustice are crumbling and new movements for change are breaking through. And I think that's the challenge and the hope of theological education is how do we, as we often say, and Reverend Barber, I can quote, how do we move from being kind of priests of the empire to being chaplains of a movement? And to do that, you need theological education that is centered and recentered around the needs and demands and priorities of those that are God's children, but especially those who have been marginalized by systems and structures of oppression. And you can't just do that politically. You can't just do that economically. You can't just do that when it comes to health and medicine and medically. You have to do that theologically. You can't push to the side these moral and theological issues and crises that we're living through. But instead, when we look at someone like Jesus, he led a political, social, economic, health, but spiritual, emotional, moral, theological movement that had the power to right the wrongs and not to let oppression and hurt and hatred have the last word. And so that's what we're pushed into, I think, in these days.
One of our viewers says justice ought to be at the center of the curriculum of not just theological education, but all U.S. education. And I couldn't agree more. Thank you tonight, Reverend Dr. Liz, Dr. Juan. We were so not only grateful for your presence, but your wisdom, thoughtfulness, the way that you approach these questions, and just the time that you spent and shared. And to all who have joined us near or far, we are grateful for this opportunity to engage, even via the cyber waves, to find connections, to learn, to grow, and to teach one another. We invite you all to journey with us for our next webinar that will be in February in honor of Black History Month, focusing on Black health and wellness. And to everyone else, have a safe and a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Jones, and thank you all for watching. The conversation doesn't stop here. Register for our upcoming travel seminar on civil rights, social justice, and the South. In February, we'll board a charter bus from Charlotte, North Carolina, and take a journey of thanks to Atlanta, Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, New Orleans, Jackson, Little Rock, and Memphis, walking with humility and gratitude in the steps of those whose brave witness paved the way for the hoped-for end of Jim and Jane Crow laws, desegregation, and a separate but not so equal way of life for African Americans in the Deep South. Visit upsem.edu for details. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.